Well, we're rolling. Thank you so much for coming in, Mark. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on your thesis defense today. That's a big deal.
Oh, thanks very much. Like I said, it's 1,000-ton weight off my shoulder, and glad it's all done.
So does this mean you're officially a doctor now?
I'm officially a doctor.
Wow.
Well, unofficially. Got a few changes to make, but I'm unofficially a doctor. Yeah.
Got to have a few emails to tweak there.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So just starting off today, I thought we could kind of guide this podcast around your career and how you've worked through it, because I know you've had a very varied career from different continents around the world and different avenues in general. So I think we could start off by maybe a message for all of your students and everyone that you've taught. So if you were to give your students one message as to a piece of advice or anything like that as what they could do to live a successful life from their career in university, or something they could do to help their trajectory, what would that be from your position as an educator?
It's actually something I thought about recently.
Oh, really?
And it gets back to the whole idea of learning. Be open to learning, be open to new ideas, and never treat learning as a necessary evil.
Okay.
Always take learning as something that's enjoyable. And if you focus on the learning and the growth that comes from it, everything will fall into place.
And how have you incorporated that into your career and your life now, or is it something that even still you're working on?
I think it's something that everybody always works on.
Yeah.
Doing my PhD recently was continued learning. And what I learned from doing this recently was that, in actual fact, I learned how to learn all over again. And now it sets me up to continue to explore and do new types of learning and build up my knowledge base. And I think that applies to anybody, no matter what stage of their career they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ability to learn is incredibly underrated. If you can open up a book and figure out how to take out information properly from that book, you can go anywhere and learn anything.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that even I'm trying to learn. Like a goal for myself this summer is to read a lot more and just learn more that way. Like I have a lot of business and entrepreneurship books that I'm trying to get into. So yeah, I think that'd be a great recommendation to any of your students and anyone coming up like that. Yeah.
I think it's interesting you talk about reading. And the one thing I encourage students to do is to continuously read. And don't become dependent on social media, but go out and read books. And don't necessarily read books on business or entrepreneurship or innovation. Read on other topics that in actual fact is going to enhance your thinking. And it's going to allow you to be able to pull knowledge, piece it all together, and to be able to come up with your own perspective. And you'll get that from reading. And not just reading business and the technical aspects of business or innovation or economics, but many things. I'll share for my example. Outside of my business readings and what I have to do for my profession, I enjoy reading history and I enjoy reading moral philosophy. History gives you a perspective of what happened in the past, why it happened, and why these developments could repeat themselves in the future. And moral philosophy gives you a perspective on what you believe to be right and wrong and what guides you in your life. And that life can include your relationships with people, but also your career as well, too.
I remember one of the first things you ever taught in our management class was that history is cyclical. And I thought that was such an important lesson because I'd heard of it before, but you gave specific examples throughout the 20th century of how things kind of repeated and where we might be going now. And I think a lot of times people in my generation will see history as, oh, that was a story. That's the past. I'm living in the present. That doesn't affect me now. But I think that couldn't be further from the truth. If you want to look at everyone's failures in the past and learn from them, history is the place to do it. I think, like you said, there's so much to learn from it. And something that I learned recently that really surprised me was Mike Tyson, one of the best boxers of all time, huge history buff. Yeah. He studied the greats. Like he loves Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and what he would do before his fights was embody what they would do and their strategies, and he was obsessed with them growing up, and that really surprised me because you wouldn't think of someone like Mike Tyson as someone who'd be interested in history or anything really intellectual, but clearly there's a lot more going on behind the walls there. Yeah.
Well, you think about boxing, and I'm not a boxing expert, although I know my grandfather was a big boxer, and he went over from Scotland to New York City and spent time there working and did boxing before he came back to Scotland and married my Nana. But when you think about boxing, there's a physical rigor, but there's tactics and there's techniques. And there's a psyche that you have to need in order to be able to execute those tactics. And I think that's where Mike Tyson was very smart, is understanding those tactics, understanding the philosophy that drove people and how they were able to execute and live out their goals and objectives. I think Tyson was really smart that way.
Yeah, I don't think you could get that far without having some intellect.
No.
Yeah.
No. I think you look at great sports heroes, for example, and you look at, say, probably I would admit the greatest quarterback ever was Tom Brady.
Tom Brady.
Tom Brady was very tactful. Mm-hmm. He was very sharp. He was always very observant of what was going on. And he learned from what he did in the past and continued to apply it moving forward. I think of great hockey players like Wayne Gretzky. He was exactly the same thing. Wayne Gretzky was intelligent, sharp, knew how to act very quickly, very observant with what was going on. But here's one thing also about these great athletes. They were gentlemen. They were civil. Their conduct with other people was extremely good. They weren't self-absorbed people. And I think that's one thing that made them great athletes.
Being generous and looking out for others first, is that?
They were generous. They looked out for others. And they always showed a respect to other people, even though in a sports arena, they were competitors.
Right, because a lot of times in those, who you just named, they're all team sports. So without their teammates, they're nothing.
That's right.
So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and a rising tide lifts all boats. So if they don't help each other, they're kind of screwed as well. So I think that's a very powerful analogy. And I think it translates back into, like, anyone could use that in their daily lives, like a career. You think, oh, if I want to advance my career, I have to maybe take down someone else because there's a limited amount of space out there. But I think that couldn't be further from what you should do and what the truth is. Because I think if you uplift people genuinely, not just like for, I don't know, if you have a private gain, everyone benefits no matter what, no matter how you look at it. There's a way where you can uplift everyone else and you benefit as well. It's a concept we're actually touching on right now in our ethics class in CSR versus CSV, where it's like, how can a company gain profit while also doing something that would be deemed as like a charitable act? And I think that concept was so cool to me. What do you think about that as a professor?
That's actually something I've given a lot of thought to recently. And I think that when you look at business as an organization, and I don't think it really matters what product or service that you're creating. And we know that business is ultimately there to create value for shareholders. And we know that's the ultimate objective of business. But regardless of how you do it, think about what business is important about. Business is a vehicle through which people come together. They interact. They build friendships. They build relationships. They collaborate with each other. They learn how to respect with each other. And it's an opportunity for people to express themselves and show their talents. I think that one thing that's going to underpin the success of any business is to recognize that business is a social vehicle more than just simply a narrow means of making profit and making money.
That's a very interesting view on that. I've never heard that before.
Well, I think you always have to remember that, and it's one thing I would say to students is, always remember, your life is not about you. You don't exist here exclusively for yourself. You exist for other people. How you assist people, how you guide people, how you help them in different circumstances, how you motivate people. And it really goes back to something my dad always used to teach me when I was growing up. You always get back tenfold more than you give.
I think that's some very wise wisdom there. Yeah, your purpose is to help people.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people my age, and it's a little bit of a new a new wave in my generation to lose sight of that. And I know a lot of people, I know myself, the times I've been happiest are times where I am exerting that help to other people rather than thinking, how do I feel better right now because things are bothering me? I can see that applying to a lot of areas of life. That's some great wisdom your dad had there.
It sure was. And I always remember my dad advising me when I went out into my career. And I remember him telling me as I was going through job interviews. And the one thing that he always reminded me of was when you go to your interview, remember the message you want to leave, especially in the early stages of your career, is your openness and your willingness to learn and to take the expertise and the knowledge and the insight from people who have been at it a lot longer than you have.
Absolutely.
Yep. And there was also another piece of advice my dad used to give me. It's one I live by as well, too. And it was probably one of his greatest statements. Never confuse your ambitions with your capabilities.
And what did he mean by that?
What did he mean by that? He said, you obviously the things you want to achieve and you want to achieve certain goals, but recognize you can't be good at everything. Understand what your true capabilities are and try and not do things that exceed your capabilities or exceed your interest. Otherwise, you're going to falter. You're not going to succeed, and you're going to come across as arrogant and conceited. And that was very much the wisdom that my dad offered me.
That's very much against the fake it till you make it philosophy you hear around a lot.
Well, what do you mean by the fake it till you make it?
Well, in the context I've heard it, it's, okay, let's say there's a gap in your skill set when you're looking for a career. Maybe don't highlight the gap, but highlight the stuff that you are good at and then figure out the rest along the way. Maybe that's a little bit different from what you were talking about, but I think there is some value to working within your means and recognizing what you're good at. And maybe he was saying, don't go for the things that you know you aren't inherently good at. Emphasize on your strengths.
That's exactly what he was saying.
Okay.
Is to emphasize your strengths, recognize that the capabilities you develop are something that you're going to build up over time through learning and through practice and repetitive routines. That's, of course, what we define as capabilities in business strategy, but it's very true within real life. And that's really what my dad was saying.
Mark, I want to get into your career a little bit here because it's very, very fascinating. I wanted to ask you, as someone who's traveled a lot in their early career and going throughout, what did traveling do for your perspective on what you wanted out of your career, what you wanted out of life, and how has it changed how you led your life in general?
I would say that, well, my first experience leaving Canada was in the early 90s and going down to South Africa for 2 years. That was the first stage in my international career, my international travel. And when I reflect upon it, there were many things that came out. Why did I go? Was I conscious of where my career was going? Absolutely not. To me, it was itchy feet. It was to go off and see a part of the world that was interesting, that was in the news at the time, and get a chance to see what it was like.
Because at the time, South Africa wasn't exactly the safest place, was it?
No, it wasn't, and it didn't continue to be safe. And of course, South Africa was just coming out of the apartheid era.
Yes.
And the system was changing, and they were moving up to their first full and free elections several years later. So I was down in South Africa during that transition phase, which made it interesting. You were actually watching history.
Wow.
But I think there were many things that came out of that international experience. One, it was learning to enjoy other people for who they are. People of different backgrounds and people of different cultures, people who had very different perspectives. The second thing was it gave a sense of confidence. The fact that you could actually get up and leave your comfort zone and go do something that was risky and potentially challenging, and in the meantime, thoroughly enjoy it. And I think that what it also brought to me was that I had worked in a domestic industry in Canada, but going off to South Africa, and I was exploring different markets around the world, I soon realized that my career was going to be focused on global business.
That's amazing.
And not local business.
Yeah. Wow. I think That's very inspiring. I think a lot of people would love to have the career that you've had and as much travel as you did.
Mm-hmm.
But as you got older, did you seek to have a little bit more stability and less travel?
Eventually, what happens is you get tired of traveling.
Yeah.
Okay. Flying on an airplane on business class and living in hotels and living on an expense account isn't as exciting as it may sound.
Really?
It's enjoyable when you're young and when you're single and you're getting out and you're seeing different parts of the world and you're having a chance to travel, on the company's time and the company's expense. It's wonderful. But you also get to the stage in life where you realize the old expression, a rolling stone gathers no moss. And eventually what happens is that you want to settle down and you want to take the knowledge that you've built up. And of course, one of the things that forces you to settle down is marriage.
That'll do it.
And that will do it.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what it does. And you begin to realize that in the time that you went traveling around the world, living in different places, meeting different people, and how exciting it was, you eventually get to a stage where you say, okay, that's wonderful, but now what do you do with it? One of the things I've enjoyed in coming into my academic career is to be able to take my experience and share that with my students and relay it in my classes and things like that. And that is what has been the most rewarding aspect of my career, is to be able to take those experiences and share it with people like you, who I'm really envious of. You're in your early 20s, you're off to start your career, you don't know where your life is going.
Well, let me say, as someone who heard those stories in your class, they were my favorite part, for sure. I loved hearing about all your travels, and it made me think, oh, this guy's teaching me international business, and he's been around to those places that we're speaking of right now. That makes me feel a lot better. And yeah, I think your class was definitely one of the most intriguing, and I think I learned the most of that class in my entire university career. And I take a lot with me in my career now as I'm looking at graduating. And I think you helping my friends and I go to that case competition in the States, really, like you said, it was one of those experiences where you got to go to South Africa, build up your confidence. We got to go face other schools in the States. You can see that you can thrive in another atmosphere, and it's just another stage of building up your confidence. This makes me actually think of something. So in first year, I know I wasn't alone in this. A lot of people feel the same way. People come to university with a sense of imposter syndrome of, oh, I don't know if I'm ready for this. Everyone around me seems so much more knowledgeable than me. And I finally, in the last 2 years, I've shaken this. And as a professor, you teach a wide range and age of students. When do you see students typically kind of phasing out of that, or even if they do, and what would your advice be to students who are experiencing that now?
I see it around third year. If I were to pinpoint a specific point in time, I think by third year, students start to get out of that phase and realize in actual fact that, no, they're not inferior.
Yep.
Everybody else is going through the exact same thing. They're uncertain. They're not too sure if they're doing things correctly. They're not too sure if they're capable of getting through this. But then by the time they get to the third and the fourth year, then they start to settle down. And they start to realize that, yes, after going through the first 2 years, I'm actually capable of doing this. And again, what I see among students is an anxiety. And where I see anxiety is students get anxious about grades. And again, this goes back to what we were just talking about at the beginning of this podcast. Don't get hung up on the grades. Take your education as not a necessary evil. Take it as a chance to explore, to learn, to learn new things, to meet and deal with new people. And if you enjoy that and you enjoy the learning aspect out of it, the marks will fall into play.
Yep.
Don't get too hung up about the grades.
I know that's the kind of thought process that they use in the Netherlands in their teaching program, where it's problem-based learning, which is something I think that a lot more places should integrate. And I've noticed the international students that I've spoken to who come from there typically do the best. And I remember I had a professor who spoke about that specific system, and he said, I had a student come in, and at the beginning of each semester, I asked them what their preferred grade would be in my class. And everyone said, A's, like I really want to try my best, new grade here. And that was the only student who said, oh, whatever the passing grade is, as long as I get it, I'm more interested in learning. And they did the best. And they were from that system in the Netherlands where they learn based off of what is the information rather than how do I maximize my output to get the best mark.
Right. And what you realize is that as you're going out into your career and you're going through your first job interview and you get the job and you're working with people, nobody cares about your grades.
No.
What they really care about is, are you willing to learn? Are you continuing to grow and develop? And are you using your skills and your talent and your knowledge to the best of your ability? That's what people are concerned about.
How have you used that to your advantage and really explored and learned throughout your career, whether it be through different authors, through different mentors that you've experienced through your life? What avenues have you explored to really make sure that you capture the most information that you can help out in whatever career you're in?
That's an interesting question. Because I think there are so many things that help me figure out what my career path would be. Let me kind of go through it if we go through a timeline.
Sure.
I came out of my undergrad,
Okay.
and I recognized that quantitative skills were important. So my first job out of my undergrad was statistical and econometric modeling. And I got to work with a fellow who mentored me. He was a PhD in econometrics from Oxford, and he taught me a lot
Wow.
about how to use this. And these were skills that I started to build up. And what I found was that as you started applying your skills and people were interested in those, they started to give you new opportunities. And formally and informally, people would start saying to you, based upon what you're capable of doing and where you are, this is where I think you should be headed. I remember in South Africa, he was my mentor. He had brought me over, Paddy Probert, whom I still keep in touch with and I think extremely highly of him. And Paddy said to me when I was in South Africa, I see your skills and I see where you're going, and I know you're moving on to South Africa and you're going to work in Europe. He said, you clearly have very good quantitative analytical skills related to market research and marketing strategy. And he said, Mark, or he used to call me Marconi actually, he'd say, I think you're going to end up in one of the nickel mining companies and you're going to be running their market research. That's actually what happened.
And that was a complete guess, or I guess
that
forecast
was
on his
6
part?
years before I got the job.
Wow.
He just seemed to know that. And as I listened to him, and I remember him saying that to me, and as I went through my career, I thought I wasn't striving towards that, but it's just the way things evolved. He saw it. And you got to remember, he was more senior than I was, and I was a young 20-something at that time.
Yeah.
And that's where he envisaged where I was going. And that really goes back to what young people should do. Don't challenge people who are older than you. Don't be confrontational with them. Listen to them. They have wisdom, experience, and they've seen history, and they know how things develop.
Right.
And if they can identify your strengths and your talents and steer you where they think you're going to be best suited, listen to them.
Absolutely. I think it's very important. I know a lot of people just will dismiss someone based off of arrogance, and it's a very important skill to think, oh yeah, I think other people around me will always know something I don't, no matter who you are. And dismissing that could be really bad for anything. Like you're missing out on so much that way.
I think if you take a look back, and I can understand what it was like being young and thinking I knew everything.
Yeah.
And I was smarter than the average person, and I did this, and this was the greatest thing in the world. Well, you realize, of course, that in actual fact, it wasn't exceptional. It was a license to lead on to other things. And when I look back, and I think to the advice that people used to give me, and how they used to steer me, I really value everything they said, because where they directed me and what they saw where I was best suited ultimately came that way. I knew eventually in my career there were several people that said to me, I could see you teaching.
Yeah.
And it eventually happened.
That's a good transition to what I was going to talk to you about next. Do you think that it is important to have creativity in a job? because I'm on the edge of like going out of university into my own career. And from what I've identified, the times I'm happiest is not necessarily artistically. It doesn't need to be that way. But when I feel that I'm thinking in ways that aren't traditional, like cookie cutter, you follow a few steps. It's more like, you're thinking outside of the box in a way that isn't planned. It's not a way that you can read in the textbook. That's when I feel the most alive and like I like what I'm doing.
Yeah.
That's why I loved cases, because if you do think linearly, you won't do well. You won't really find a problem or find a solution to the problem. So do you think that kind of a exercise for someone is important for them to enjoy their career?
I think what's important to recognize is that you may have basic skills that show up in routines, but how you approach them as a person, especially in terms of how you interact with others, is going to be a reflection of your uniqueness and your own personality. That really is a roundabout way of saying, always be yourself. Get up. When I get up into a classroom, as you've probably seen, I've used humor. Part of the reason I use humor is because that allows me to relate with students. It makes me relaxed. And to me, it makes the teaching experience more enjoyable, I think, for me and for others as well.
I can contest that, yeah.
You always apply a technique and a personal approach that you're comfortable with. Because what people will realize is that if you're being yourself and you're not going through a rote methodology, then people will truly appreciate what you're doing.
It's very easy to see when someone has a mask up, and it's not, you find it harder to connect with them.
Yeah. It's always important to very much be yourself. And it really goes back to, I think, what I think about in terms of my own philosophy or my own thinking is you can't love other people unless you love yourself first. And so you have to love and respect yourself and recognize that the unique way that you present yourself to the world, the unique way you bring your talents to the world, okay, is something that you should be comfortable with. Again, there's a reason you exist, and you exist for other people. And how you interact with other people is going to be different from everybody else in the world. Love and respect that.
Do you think the way that people now are exposed to so many other people that they were never exposed to before through different forms of social media and constant comparison, because that's just how we are, do you think that makes it harder for people to be themselves these days?
I think it's always difficult for people to be themselves. Look, myself growing up, I remember peer pressure. Maybe it's exacerbated because of social media today, and I'm only speculating on that. But that peer pressure was always there. And there's always that need to conform and fit in. As you start to mature as a person, you begin to realize that, yes, I have to engage with other people and my responsibilities to other people. But that doesn't mean that I have to sacrifice who I am in order to fit in. You start to become very comfortable and respectful of who you are as a person. And when you start to develop that maturity, then you find that you're more engaging with people, you're more comfortable with what you're doing. And I think it's always important for students to remember that, yes, love and respect yourself first. That doesn't mean that you do everything exclusively for yourself, but always remember that you're here for a reason, and you have very special talents and very special gifts and a very unique personality. And never, ever get concerned about being flawed or making mistakes. Because you want to know something? One of the things that's enjoyable about human beings is looking at their flaws and enjoying those aspects of it without being critical. And I think that goes back to one thing. I would say one thing to students. Learn to laugh at yourself. Don't take yourself so seriously.
Can't do that.
Why not?
I know I used to be like that, much more serious. And all that ended up happening was you don't enjoy life as much. It's a great way to be miserable. I think being able to laugh at yourself, making light of your mistakes, allows you to look at them through a different lens and actually be able to learn from them. Whereas if you take yourself too seriously, your mistakes seem like this giant mountain. Like, oh my God, I can't believe I got that bad mark on that test. I'll never be able to recover from this. I'm now tainted.
I find that funny, and I see that with several students who get all uptight over the fact that they didn't get the mark that they thought that they deserve. And in their mind, it's completely unacceptable. And yet what they fail to realize is, at the end of the day, do you know how much that's going to affect your overall grade? 1 or 2 percentage points. And somehow something else will make up for it at the end of the day.
Yep. Yeah, that was something you always emphasized. If someone got a bad grade, it would be able to be made up in the future as long as you paid attention, you did the work, and you understood what was happening.
Correct.
I want to touch back on something you were talking about before about being yourself. Was there a moment in your life where you snapped into thinking, okay, I'm going to think less of what other people want and I'm going to act exactly how I feel? Or was there an activity or a point in your life where it was a turning point? Because I know for me there was. Weirdly enough, completely unexpected, just for exercise and because I loved it, I started skateboarding about a year and a half ago.
Oh, yeah.
And just it has a reputation of being kind of destructive, and the people who do it maybe aren't, I don't know, like into drugs or anything like that. That's not at all why I did. I just did it because I thought it was fun. And I learned to just not care what other people thought while I was doing it. And weirdly enough, I carried that with me even when I wasn't skateboarding. And it's really, really, really changed how I view what other people think. And now I go about my life and I don't exactly think like, oh, this person's judging me this way, this person's judging me this way. I kind of do what I want. And it's been a huge shift. So I was wondering if you had anything similar to that in your life.
That was one of the great experiences when I went to South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
The numerous friends I made and the people that I enjoyed and equally enjoyed me. And for whatever reason, maybe it was a different context, maybe it was just because it was a different experience, but I started to realize that yes, people can really enjoy you for who you are and enjoy being with you and respect you in the same way that you respect them. That was very much a big turning point for me.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people have a similar experience from traveling.
And I would also say that keep in mind, it wasn't just that one period in time. There was eventually a continued growth and a realization that, yes, you don't become overly focused on what people think about you. And I would probably say that it was probably as I was getting towards my 40s that I started to think quite differently about that.
How so?
In the sense that I started to, I had done certain things in my life and I'd achieved certain things in a professional sense. But I had met my wife. Mm-hmm. And I think of all the people that I had met in the past and had gone out with, and now here was somebody who seemed to be the culmination of everybody you knew in the past and was the absolute perfect person for you. And meeting that right woman and her sharing the exact same sentiments that you had towards her was a real life-changing experience.
Would you say that shared viewpoint is a very important aspect of a relationship in terms of getting along?
Very much so.
Yeah.
You recognize that the person will always be different from you, and you don't mold the person into your own way. But for whatever reason, you come to a realization that says, I remember meeting my wife and thinking, wow, how could I ever be with somebody like that? She's beautiful, she's sweet, she's kind, she's the type of person people want to be with. And then you get the realization, the signs over time, well, she's actually thinking the same way about you.
Wow. Mm-hmm. I guess unless you're someone who's very conceited, most people would probably say the same thing of, oh, I'd never thought that could happen to me as well. I think that's very interesting. Mm-hmm. People at my age were going through the motions, figuring things out as well. Yeah. What would you say is some advice if you could go back to your 20, 25-year-old self and say, hey, here's what you should do in your relationship life to gear yourself up? Or even if you would just say, hey, you did the right thing. I think that I wouldn't change anything about that era.
You'll go out with different people.
Mm-hmm.
You'll date different people. You'll have different relationships. And if it doesn't work out, don't overanalyze it.
Yeah.
And don't become saying, well, this person was like this, and therefore it was their fault this relationship didn't work out, or I didn't do this correctly. That's part of the learning. And that's part of the enjoyment of going out with different people. Because then eventually, when, as they always say, that right person comes along, well, you've had that experience.
Do you believe in a soulmate?
Well, I am a religious, spiritual person. There's no question about it. Do I believe that there's a right person for me? Yes, but I don't believe it's predestined.
Okay. I think I'm along similar lines.
Yep.
I think that people grow together through their experiences, and that everyone has a base compatibility. And then beyond that, it's how the time you spend together goes.
Yeah. One thing in any relationship, and marriage is a great test of building a relationship. Marriage is an intimate relationship, but when you think about friendships, platonic, when you think about platonic relationships, or if you think about work relationships, marriage a real test of being able to build a relationship. Why? You overcome adversities. You realize that the person is not going to totally change because you're in a marital situation. And yet you always go back to one thing. Why did you marry that person? And you always have to remember the reason why you married that person. And that foundation will continue to exist throughout your marriage. So always think about your friendships and your relationships with people in work. Why did you build those relationships, and why are they important? Think about the foundation and carry that foundation moving forward.
Wow. I think that's some very good advice. And transitioning back to business and work, how have you figured out a work-life balance in your life?
I will say this. Going into academics gave me a work-life balance that I had never seen before in the industry.
Really?
Oh, very much so. And I think it was a realization that as I'd gone through my career, I wasn't going to go into a senior level executive position. And I didn't want that. I had a desire to go out and teach. For whatever reason, I just felt that that's something I wanted to do. But I soon realized that going into teaching was a noble career. It was something that you were giving back to others. It was a career that was very rewarding. Financially, it certainly is not bad. But it's a good work-life balance.
But I think you're right, a noble career, because for someone with your career and your expertise, I think you certainly could have gone off to some senior role in a company and made much more money that way. But I think there's something to be said about what you do in your career to give back to others. I think that is something that a lot of people overlook when going to the career. If you could balance supporting yourself, helping others out, and as well as being interested yourself, I think that's the perfect career. And from what I am hearing from you, it sounds like that's kind of what you found.
Oh, yeah, very much so. That old balance I've certainly found in my academic career, but also recognize it's also a mature stage of my life. My thinking today is different than when I was in my early 20s. As you'll find out, Davis, when you become my age, you'll start thinking the same way. But I also look back and I look at people like yourselves and the things you're doing. And to some degree, I wouldn't say I'm envious, but I look back and I look back at the lives that you're living, and I look back at it with very fond memories, because they were wonderful times. They were free-spirited, they were fun times, they were times of learning, times to go out and do silly things and make mistakes. But you know what? They're also great stories that you can tell your grandchildren.
Absolutely. No, This is the time to develop those stories in my life, at least.
Yep.
Did you find yourself often enjoying the present, or was that never an issue for you and you always found time to, live life to the fullest in that moment and not get caught up too far in what your future would look like or past events?
I don't think I was ever the type of person that was overly preoccupied with where the future was going. I wasn't going to say, in 10 years' time of this, I'm going to be a senior vice president or whatever the case may be. No, I enjoyed the opportunities as I was doing them. I recognized that there was an appropriate time to change and to move on, and I did. And as a result, I continued to enjoy each experience as they came along.
Do you think there is a harm in trying to plan things meticulously?
Absolutely not. There are certain things that you do want to achieve, and you recognize there's certain things that you have to do in order to attain a specific state in the future.
Mm-hmm.
When I came into academics, it was clear I had to get my PhD.
Yep.
So I had to go do that. What that meant specifically where I was going to be in the future, I really didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I know I needed that foundation in order to be successful in academics and enjoy the benefits of an academic career.
And what pulled you from the whole corporate world back into academia?
I'll be honest with you, it was a health scare.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
From stress?
No, related to a chronic condition I have.
Okay.
It took a turn for the worse, and I was hospitalized and had several rounds of surgery. And it made me reflect upon a lot of things. And it was during that time that I saw to myself, it was funny, I was over in Britain at the time working, and I thought, it was almost prescient in that I thought I could see myself back in Niagara, I could see myself teaching, and I could see my life being quite different than what it had been in the consulting and the corporate world.
Yep.
That's just the way that it ultimately worked out. It was at that time that I really thought about wanting to go and teach. I came back and I went back into the corporate world. At that time, the financial crisis hit. There was downsizing of management that affected me. And I thought at that time, okay, this is now the opportunity for me to go into academics. And so
Wow.
I did it.
So it was a time to reflect in your life.
Very much so.
I think a lot of people had that same kind of opportunity around the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
It was very stop and reflect kind of time in a lot of people's lives. I almost actually switched degrees during that time.
Really? What
Yeah.
were you thinking of doing?
Well, I knew I loved to talk to people.
Yeah.
And I thought in my head, if I do business, I'm going to be stuck in a job where I'm going to be at a cubicle all day, not speaking. And that scared me a lot. And I now know that's not right. And if I didn't have the time to stop and reflect during COVID, I would have been in psychology. That's what I was thinking of going into.
Really?
Nothing wrong with psychology, but I now know that I was meant for this degree and business. And I think other areas, like maybe starting this podcast, are ways that I can express that side of myself. I don't even think necessarily I was interested in how the career paths you would take through psychology. I think it was more just like, oh yeah, I like talking to people.
Yeah.
And I thought, what do you do? And what's the career where you talk to people? Yeah, probably like a therapist. That's what I would be. Yeah.
And it's an important point you make. There are going to be circumstances that happen in life, and they could be a health situation. They could be a change in a contextual situation. It could be economic recession. It could be a pandemic. It could be some sort of thing that could actually force you to take a step back and take stock of life. And I think that what you bring up is also something I think that students should always remember. These situations are going to happen. Mm-hmm. And regardless of that, you have to, I'm not saying that you anticipate them, and you certainly hope they don't come about. But when they do, you have to learn how to manage them because they're radical change. And you have to be able to manage that radical change and decide to yourself, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to adapt? And what changes do I have to need if I really feel that this situation is negatively affecting me?
I think a lot of times people get paralyzed by the choice. I know, especially in a young age, you think, okay, the choices I make now have a huge impact on my later life. And if I go down the wrong path here, it could be irreversible. How have you mitigated that fear of thinking the choices I make now will impact the rest of my life and made them with a clear conscience?
I used to think when I was in university, whatever courses or whatever education I took, that basically determined my life. Mm-hmm. But in actual fact, I realized that as you took on opportunities that came about and you capitalized on those opportunities and you grew and developed in terms of skills and knowledge and you could apply it to other areas. And when those other opportunities came up, you moved. You realize soon that in actual fact, just because, I studied economics and statistics and urban and regional economics, that this was going to be my career.
Mm-hmm.
No. The thing about learning, and this is one thing students should know, it's a license for future opportunities. What a degree teaches you is not so much knowledge and not so much skills, but it basically gives you the ability to learn. And again, that's why I come back and stress, it's always important as you go into the world when you graduate, especially with an employer, that you express your openness to learn.
That's very powerful. I think I was actually talking with Abdul about that, and he said what a degree does is it proves that you can, one, be punctual, you can do things on time, and also that you have the capacity to learn new things. That is truly what a degree shows you, because sometimes I think I have friends who didn't go to post-secondary, and I see they're very smart, capable people, and I think, what is the real difference between them and me? And I said, it comes down to they don't have proof that they can be a learner in this situation. That's really it. But I think it's important to show that in other ways. And like you said, you should never stop. And someone who thinks that they're completely done after university, I think people do that. But in my mind and from my perspective now at the beginning of my career, I think that's a wasted opportunity, because there's so much more that you don't know than you do. And I don't think you can ever possibly be on the other side of that.
I'll share with you, I remember meeting a man years ago who was completing his PhD in physics, and he was 72 years of age.
Wow, that's incredible.
And there's a reason he did it, and this is something else I would share with students. He didn't do it because it was going to open up a new career for him, and he was going to write a best-selling novel that was going to compete with Stephen Hawking's. He did it because it was good. And that's one thing students should also remember about their experience at university and their learning. Are you doing it because of a career? Are you doing it because of what it benefits to you? No. Everything will fall into place when you realize one thing. What you're doing is basically good. And what you're doing is you're pursuing what is good. And you always have to remember that pursuing education and pursuing it as a good is a foundation that sets you up to want to pursue other things that are good. And doing that, you desire the good of other people. Again, it gets back to your life isn't about you.
How would someone go about their life pursuing the good? Because that's just explain to me, because it's a little bit of a vague term.
When you're in business, let's take a look at it within the business context. You're working with people. Somebody needs your assistance to get something done. Do you do it because of an anticipated reward? No, you do it because it's the right thing to do. It's basically a good. When you go out with a student and a student asks for help and wants to talk to you, do you do it because there's going to be something in return? No, you do it because it's basically good, because it helps the other person.
Such as this right now.
Such as this right now. That's what it's all about.
And intrinsically, that, going back to the advice your dad gave you, that will make yourself better. It's almost, in a weird way, a selfish act by helping someone else.
It is, but your motivation is
Yes.
not the self-reward. Your motivation is
The aid of others.
the aid of others, the good of others.
Yes.
Whatever you define that good to be.
Wow. I think that's a very powerful tool. Follow the good. That's something I really hadn't thought of in my life, at least. I think something that could be applied to a lot of is, I know a lot of people now, mental illness is a big thing, and some people think, how do I get better? How do I improve myself? And a good place to start, I think a lot of the time, is helping other people. And if people thought of, how do I do the most good? I think that would be a tremendous force of help for many people.
I think you're right. I think that focusing on others and your relationship with others, no matter what that may be, I think is a significant start to improving mental health. Because if you I look at some things that can cause unnecessary anxiety, and I see it today, and I've even seen it among myself and others within the past. You're too focused on yourself. You're taking yourself too seriously. And you're not accepting the fact that you are a fallible human being who's going to make mistakes, but that fallibility is also an enjoyable aspect of you. And when you can get around that, you can get past, if you want to say, the mental health issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I think a lot of things that I've realized, there's certain systems people use to guide their lives, whether it be religion or a political view. And now, because of the dissolution of a lot of people's religious beliefs, there's other maybe more less guided areas people turn to. And I think it can be very confusing of what to do in life and what direction to take because of that. I know I felt it personally myself. Something that I've thought was very intriguing just in recent years, and I've been doing a lot of reading up on it, was Stoicism. And I thought very simple and pragmatic way of leading your life. And just the fact that that wisdom has lasted the test of time, I think says a lot. Have you researched or looked into Stoicism at all?
I just finished reading a book called Dominion.
Oh, I've never
And
heard
it was a book by a historian in Britain called Tom Holland. And what he talked about was, from a historical perspective, how Christianity had big influence on the modern world. And he was looking at it in terms of the developments and the habits and the thoughts and the structures that very much play out in our society today. And one of the things that Holland mentioned was the philosophy of the Stoics, and the fact that there was an overall force that was guiding the universe and the developments of things. Now, that ultimately combined with Aristotelian thinking that ultimately evolved into Christian thinking, such as people like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. And I will admit that Thomas Aquinas is probably the thinker in the past who's had the greatest influence on my thinking and on my life.
Yeah, I think Stoicism is a very noble and logical way of organizing your thoughts in life. And the applications to modern life, even though the differences between life now and then are insurmountable, the applications are uncanny to what the Stoics thought of and what they realize is important in life. And as someone who's, had a very weathered life and been through a lot, where would you say the importance lies in making sure your life is valued and you feel a sense of purpose from what you do and how you carry yourself?
I think you always have to recognize that your existence is not random. You exist for a reason. If you want to take it from a religious point of view, you could say that, yes, you exist for a reason. You're part of a greater plan. And when you come to realize that, that's where you start to develop a self-respect. I think it's important to reason that there is a purpose to your existence and that you're valuable in who you are as an individual.
So self-respect, self-value.
It's very much a self-respect, yeah. Again, if you can't love yourself, you can't love other people.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this. And I want to thank you very much for coming on. I know you're a very busy guy, so I really, really appreciate it. And I wish you the best now that you have a doctor at the beginning of your name. That's a very exciting thing. So congratulations again. And
thank you so much. And thanks very much. I thoroughly enjoyed this, Davis. And, it's always my pleasure to help you out.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Take care.